Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, lots of people have pointed out to me that I've been very unfair to Anat for continuously making fun of her age. And I would like to clarify the record and say that Anat is actually someone who looks wonderfully young, to the extent that Michael Shapira, you're actually a really dirty old man. I want to talk about a couple of things. Our case is pretty simple here. This isn't a case, I'm not going to lecture you guys and say, move on, it's in the past. That's not our case. Our case is very simple. It's just not in your interest anymore to be doing this. It is a pure utilitarian case to say, we want to move on. Purely, not because, like, yeah, hold on to that bitterness all you want. Actually, bitterness is great. And if people want to hand themselves in, yeah, fine, prosecute them. Like, that's grand. If they confess, that's fine. But we just think it's not worth investing resources and political capital into actually trying to capture or kill them anymore for a number of reasons. Let's think about how this practically happens. Because this typically tends to be outside the state of Israel, and one is, other countries don't like it when you tend to go into their lands, okay? That's one thing. The next point is, it's a case of saying is that, if you look at history, the last time there's been successful prosecution within Israel of someone for these crimes was back in the 1950s with Eichmann. The last time that there was one was tried was the 1980s with a guy who, I can't really pronounce his name properly, but Dan Yanyuk, I think it was. I think terrible is what I was told to call him by Anat. She's the one who actually knows about Israel in this debate. But she was saying that the last time, that was the 1980s, they tried to prosecute and failed, and we actually think there's massive damage from trying to prosecute and failing. And that's something which we think is a big issue. Because why are these trials unsuccessful? And that's my first point, is substantive. The reason why these trials are unsuccessful is because of the fact that so much time has passed. There's a number of factors. One is you don't have DNA evidence. Two is people's appearances change. Yes, Anat hasn't aged a day in 10 years. And a lot of these people in 60 years don't look a bit like they did when they were at the concentration camp guard or whatever it was they were. Unfortunately, these people look completely different, and the people who you might want to be witnesses are now unfortunately passed away in many cases. So the practicalities of actually getting successful prosecutions are so remote, we actually think this is highly unlikely. Go ahead.
Are you happy with Israel continuing as it does a lot of the time to work collaboratively with other countries, like Interpol and, say, Australia, to capture these people?
Yeah. Collaboratively, like, look, if we think realistically, the only case in recent years of where someone was actually prosecuted was in Germany, where someone actually handed themselves in because they were like 91 and about to die, and that's realistically the kind of case. Look, if it's that open and shut, where someone walks in and is like, hi, I'm identifying myself, you know who I was, but I've been on the run. Look, we have no problem with that, but we have absolutely a problem with saying we'd invest any sort of effort whatsoever in this, because there's no benefits whatsoever. We also think it's a case of saying that in terms of the trials being unsuccessful, what are the consequences of this? And we're also then going to talk about extrajudicial killings within this. One is, it's a case of saying, one is that when they don't work, what does this do for perceptions? When someone is prosecuted, you change the perception and you feed into anti-Semitic stereotypes of it being less about these are victims and more into about people seeking revenge. And we think that is a bad stereotype, and it's one that is only reinforced by the policy which currently exists. That if you go and you try to prosecute someone, and often these are old, feeble-looking old men. They look very sympathetic. They're kind of there, and they're there with their walking cane. They're kind of going, yeah. You just look at them and you feel sorry for them. So we think that doesn't feed into actually helping the perception at all. We also think it's a case of going, in terms of international relations, no thank you. We think that Israel has a pretty limited amount of political capital. And what we would say is that if you're going to use that political capital, we think often countries don't extradite to Israel because of, I suppose, concerns around what would happen with those, what would happen with those prisoners. We think that that doesn't happen very often. But the second thing is that, particularly if you're going to talk about extrajudicial killings, we think that the amount of political capital which you have for doing that kind of evaporates pretty quickly. Two things. One is, we think extrajudicial killings are pretty bad and wrong, and we're going to stand against that in their own right. A, because of the same reasons why we think trials are dangerous, we think extrajudicial killings are pretty dangerous because you might get the wrong person, and we think that's a pretty bad outcome. One, because it's bad. Two, because it's in its own right. Two, because it's bad if you do it and you get it wrong and it's found out that you got it wrong. Three, you may have third parties becoming harmed in this, and that is just incredibly damaging to the overall state of Israel. But even if you think that, no thank you, the state of Israel, even if you think that extrajudicial killings are okay, let's just say you're someone who believes in that, we think that most states can get away with a certain amount of them. Like Russia very successfully managed to take out someone in Britain. Israel is regarded as having successfully done that in a number of cases, for example, Iranian nuclear scientists. We're saying, if you are going to do that, prioritize who you go after. People who are 90 years old are not an active threat to the state of Israel. If you're going to do that and you have a limited amount of political capital, go after the guys who can build nuclear bombs to blow you off the face of the earth. Go ahead.
Do you really think that Mossad and Israel in general is not going after current terrorists and, like, instead only going after India?
No, that's not what we're saying at all. We're saying they're doing both at the moment. We're saying take all the guys in that hunt old people division and put them into the division for hunt people who are evil and actively evil and doing evil. Because we think that there is a limited amount of resources. Yeah, you can hire more spies, but you can't hire more people to support the Israeli lobby in the United States. The United States will support you a lot when you do things that they kind of go, that's pretty reasonable in terms of, I'd kind of kill those Iranian nuclear scientists as well too, because we probably would in the past. But they often, you can kind of say, there's a point at which it becomes politically unpalatable to be supporting these kind of things if you're killing someone who's 90 years old and living in Argentina or wherever it may be that you find them, ladies and gentlemen. So ultimately we think we're not going to say, we're not at all arguing on this side that Israel somehow has to forgive and forget. It's not that kind of a case. Don't forgive them, bloody hell. And if they turn themselves in, prosecute them. But we think that ultimately, the policies which Mossad are currently adopting, we believe, because there's nothing public on this, and we think a public statement on this is absolutely necessary to be very clear on this, and it should be seen to be stuck to. We think it's absolutely clear that we should say, A, it's not a priority for the state of Israel because of where the real threats are coming from. B, the current policy in terms of even if you could bring them to trial, we don't think it would be successful, and the harms and the backlash against Israel in terms of perception, because A, you'll never get the prosecution successfully, and B, the harms of the perception if you try and fail are so big. And then even bigger in terms of the harms is if you look at the international credibility and the fact that extrajudicial killings are just wrong, and even if you believe they're not wrong, you probably shouldn't do them because you can only kill so many people in their sleep. We're proud to stand in proposition.